don't have space for that, take a cue from vineyards that put up nest boxes for barn owls and such to successfully control gophers and voles. Parasitoids are another natural ally, very important in the vegetable garden. These insects lay or inject their eggs in or on caterpillars. And when the eggs hatch, the larvae eat the caterpillar. So you may have seen a tomato hornworm, for example, on your tomatoes and then found little eggs of braconid wasps on top of the caterpillar. There's many different species of wasps who follow a similar life cycle. And this one here is just one example. Is there some noise coming in?
I'm sorry, I just needed
oh, that's okay.
Thank you.
I just wasn't sure if it was something I was doing or if I need to stop for a second. Are we good?
Yes, we're good now. Thank you.
Okay. This is just one example of a parasitoid wasp. This is called the Trogus penator wasp, and she happens to inject her eggs in the caterpillars of swallowtail butterflies. And now I love swallowtail butterflies, as do a lot of other people, but I'm also very happy to have this wasp in my garden. She needs to eat, and her presence ensures that our sassafras, our tulip trees, our cherry trees, and other plants that are host plants for swallowtail caterpillars are going to be nibbled by some of them, but not defoliated by hordes of them, because this little lady is keeping them in check. Similarly, this taconid fly feeds on pollen and nectar as an adult, but as a larva, she'll eat caterpillars in the garden. For some reason, I just love this little creature. Next up in our list of unexpected natural allies are the herbivores, and their lifestyle habits are just as surprising. So you might see holes like this on a grapevine leaf or a blackberry leaf, and you might start to worry, oh my gosh, someone's going to eat my whole plant. But those circular holes are the telltale signs of mother leafcutter bees, important pollinators. And they cut leaf pieces out with their mandibles, and then they carry those pieces to their nests. And the nest could be a hole in a piece of wood usually, but they can be any cavity like this unused pipe. And it takes these little moms up to 3 hours to make a single nest for one egg. So we should be pretty excited if our plants are helping these pollinators. And we tend to think of honeybees as the ultimate pollinator of food crops, but in fact, many of our nearly 4,000 native bees in North America play an essential and underappreciated role in the food supplies for both humans and wildlife. And we don't need to worry about damage to the plants from these holes. They're used to it. There's fossil evidence of this relationship between plants and leafcutter bees from at least 30 million years ago. Now, here's an entirely different type of herbivore, and in this case, you might say, well, why would you highlight deer as an ally? Because a lot of people get upset with deer for eating their plants. But the answers will likely surprise you here again, because in many cases, the more natural your garden is, the more the deer can help keep certain spreading plants in check. For example, we let staghorn sumacs, sassafras trees, plants like that literally run wild. And this provides not only food for birds and mammals, and for us if we want to in the form of things like sumac lemonade, it also provides lots for deer to nibble on, especially in the winter. And in this way, they're actually keeping the plants pruned for us, and they're also not going as much to some of our more cultivated spaces. Here in this photo, there's something else going on too, though. This is the farm of Tammy Hartung. She's a farmer in Colorado, and she grows a lot of vegetables for her family, as well as herbs and flower seed for retail and wholesale. And she also makes her yard an intentionally welcoming place for wildlife, including this herd of about 30 deer overall. And what she has discovered over the years is that the deer are the best weeders of her farm's most pervasive invasive species, which is bindweed. And they love it, and they nibble it all down, and it's ended up saving tons of time and labor and thousands of dollars in equipment costs for them. And so I mention this because sometimes things aren't always what they seem. And squirrels, believe it or not, are among our natural allies, and I always like to give them a shout out because they are unfairly cast as pests, often for the crime of simply eating bird seed or doing a little digging. Squirrels are nature's foresters, though, and left to their own devices, they plant many walnuts and oaks and other valuable plants that feed both us and other species. Similarly, ants do the same thing. When they take seeds to their nest, their larvae eat fleshy coatings around the seeds, and then the remaining intact seed gets discarded into a trash pile. And then some of those seeds eventually germinate into new plants. Ants are also defenders of plants. A study in Scotland last year found that bean and cotton plants secreted sweeter nectar from their flowers, specifically to attract bodyguard ants. And then those ants go after slugs and aphids and other invertebrates who would otherwise be eating the plants. Okay, so now we're going to talk about unexpected plant allies. And are there any more questions so far, or should we keep going?
Yes, a question from Mary is, I have a 1/4 acre suburban lot with plants, feeders, water features to attract birds, but I'm also attracting, oh, you already answered it. Tons of squirrels.
Oh, oh, well, you can keep going.
Okay, tons of squirrels. Can you address ideas on how to coexist with them? Sorry, I didn't type fast enough. I'm sorry, Mary. I didn't read it before I read it out loud. Yes, she says, I think Nancy kind of addressed this.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so maybe in the meantime, I'll go on, but maybe you can say what actually they are doing. Are they digging up the plants, or what is the nature of the problem? Because squirrels can sometimes do different things, and then we can talk about it after this next section.
Good one.
So plants also have a whole range of talents that often go unappreciated, and these are just some of the natural plant allies you can start recruiting to help in your food garden. The volunteer natives that people often think of as weeds, and then the plants that attract predators and pollinators to your plot, the deterrent plants that draw insects away from your crops, and the dead and dying plants that have seen better days and are returning to the soil. One of my favorite volunteer native plants is also a predator attractant. It's called boneset. It's in the Eupatorium genus, and it often comes up entirely on its own and reseeds prolifically. It attracts parasitoids known as blue-winged wasps, and they visit these flowers for nectar, and then they also happen to lay their eggs in Japanese beetle larvae. So if you want natural controls for Japanese beetles, you can try a plant like this. And many people think that attracting predators to the garden involves going online and ordering some mail order ladybugs, and that's often a bad idea. It's a bad idea for the ladybugs who may have been harvested from the wild and often die en route. And it's a bad idea for you because you'll have to stand by helplessly as all the ladybugs who remain in the little container that's delivered to you just fly away, because that's what's going to happen unless you already have habitat for them. And if you already have habitat for them, you don't need to buy insects because they'll come on their own in due time. And one way to attract them is to add plants like milkweed to a pollinator strip around your vegetable garden. Different milkweed species attract lots of aphids who in turn are eaten in large numbers by adult ladybugs and their larvae. And milkweed's also irresistible to lots of other pollinators and predators. In one study, milkweed planted near crops attracted many times more parasitoid flies whose larvae helped devour the green stink bugs that were becoming an issue. Planting to attract these insect predators also means thinking about the habitat they need throughout the seasons. This is penstemon. It's also called beard tongue as a common name, and it's an obvious attraction for bees and hummingbirds in early summer. But what may not be so obvious is that penstemon also serves as a home for overwintering ladybugs in the cold season. It forms basal rosettes on the ground and makes a nice cover and hiding place. Also, by paying attention to who pollinates your food crops, you can start to expand the buffet for those pollinators, sometimes with native plants. So if you grow pawpaws, for example, you might recognize this flower as being very similar to a pawpaw flower, but this is actually the blossom of a wild ginger plant. Like the pawpaw, this flower attracts flies and beetles because it has a scent and a color similar to carrion, rotting meat. So if you're having trouble with pawpaw pollination, you might try adding wild ginger underneath your trees, and your trees can get a critical mass of flowers underneath they're going so that they attract these preferred pollinators, the flies and the beetles. And wild ginger is also a great native ground cover, so it will help suppress weeds too, kind of like a permanent cover crop. Plants can become great deterrents as well. This is common evening primrose. It's looking a little bit tattered and torn here because it is a magnet for Japanese beetles. As a native plant, it often volunteers, and it's yet another species that people don't understand. They pull, they think it's a weed. And wherever I let it go, though, and thrive in the garden, it feeds these Japanese beetles, and then the beetles tend to leave surrounding plants alone. And the common evening primrose also produces great flowers for pollinators. It's a magnet for bees as well. So it brings bumblebees to the blooms, and sometimes carpenter bees to the stems. So this is a plant that can do double duty for you, drawing Japanese beetles away from your crops and then bringing bees toward them. The last unexpected plant ally I'll show you here are the dead and dying plants. This may look like just a stump to us, but it's also an ally in the garden as it provides a hiding place for toads, a nesting site for beetles who bore holes that native bees will then use for their nests, a place for woodpeckers and other birds to come and find tasty snacks in the bark, and soil regeneration as it breaks down. And decaying leaves provide many similar benefits. So wherever you can leave those too in your wildflower strips or under shrubs, you'll be building up a more diverse habitat. So the last section is simple steps to achieve this kind of diversity of life in the garden. And Nikki, did you want to do questions, or do you want to just go to the end now? And
Yes, so
we have a follow-up with Mary Large. So
okay.
She says that the squirrels eat all the bird seed, all the sunflowers, and sometimes tomatoes.
Okay. So one thing you could do is cut down on the bird seed. And people love to feed birds, and I understand that that it's a great way to be able to watch them and get to know individual birds. But the more that you add native plants that feed all the animals, the more you're going to help those birds too in the long run, because they really need the insects that are attracted to those plants just as much or more, especially when they're raising their young, as they need the bird seed. So that's one thing, because that's sort of like putting out bait for squirrels sometimes, and then they'll come and be eating a lot of the other things too. And another thing is just also squirrels actually eat tons of native seeds. So I've seen them in the winter not go to, we put out bird feeders in when there's a lot of snow, just because we feel sorry for them. They can't get to the seed heads and everything. I've seen the squirrels actually go to seed heads of wild bergamot and echinacea and not to the bird feeders. And so I think, the more you just add more plants, the more you're going to be able to coexist a little bit better. So simple steps include planting native wildflowers and hedgerows, planting extras to share with animals, nurturing deterrent plants to keep animals away from plants you don't want to share, as I mentioned, nurturing life in the decay, and more broadly, constantly questioning your own assumptions and tailoring your approaches. And now I'll talk about a little bit how to implement these ideas. To attract predators and parasitoids and pollinators, you can add as many native wildflowers as your space allows. Even better, in a larger space, you can plant a whole hedgerow of shrubs and perennials and small trees that will provide both food and cover for your natural allies. To find plants native in your area and get more recommendations for how to do this, I recommend getting to know your state Native Plant Society, and also going to these 2 websites, wildflower.org/plants, which is part of Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center in Austin, but it's a national organization, and audubon.org/native-plants, which is part of the National Audubon Society. And at these databases, you can actually put your zip codes in and get lists of plants tailor-made to your region. Step 2, which I find to be the easiest and the most fun, is simply to plant extra to share with animals. This is a chipmunk from another person I profiled in my book in her garden. She's north of Toronto, and she plants extra strawberries for them after seeing how much they like them. You can also add extra rows of parsley in front of your lettuce and other greens for rabbits and deer. They'll tend to choose the tastier plant first, which for some of them is something like parsley. You can also plant a couple of extra tomato plants. And if you see tomato hornworms on the plants that you plan to harvest, just move those hornworms over to your extra tomato plants. And then those caterpillars, if they don't get preyed upon by bracconid wasps, will actually develop into pollinating sphinx moths. Another way to share your plants is to actually leave your lawn more natural where you can, or to plant an eco lawn. I received a question through Nikki in advance about rabbits from a participant named Gail. I don't know if Gail is on today, but if she is, this one is for you, Gail. This is something I've seen in my own yard. The rabbits tend to eat dandelions and clover and sorrel much more often than they eat my cultivated plants. And that's because we've let the turf grass recede and give way to little forbs that are more tasty to herbivores. And this is in a garden in New York where I gave a talk last year, and I described this exact phenomenon of eating the entire stalk and the whole kit and caboodle of this dandelion seed head. And the very next morning, this rabbit came to the garden of my host and gave us this little demo. And so this is not an infrequent occurrence if you start having more of an eco lawn. Step 3 is to nurture the deterrent plants. And if this looks a lot like dill or parsley to you, that's because this is also in the carrot family. And as such, like dill and parsley, it feeds black swallowtail butterflies. So if you want to support both the black swallowtail butterflies and be able to harvest your own dill and parsley without it getting too nibbled, you can try planting this native species nearby for the black swallowtail caterpillars. It's a perennial called Golden Alexander, and it comes back year after year, and it reseeds like crazy if it likes where it is, which it usually does. So you can just keep adding and experimenting with these ideas, and you're sure to make some interesting discoveries on your own. One farmer that I know here in Maryland had success with planting a row of sunflowers, a long row along his driveway near his tomato crop. And that was a great deterrent for stink bugs, who then left his tomatoes alone because they love the sunflowers so much. Plants past their prime also provide important food, as I mentioned, so leaving up some of your seed heads will bring birds. And then leaving leftover stalks and stumps and logs will also bring pollinators, because many insects overwinter in stalks or actually nest in there, including the 30% of our native bees who are cavity nesters. I can find this little arrow. Okay. Beetles, lacewings, damsel bugs, and other helpful predators overwinter or take shelter in leaf litter, brush piles, grassy thatch, dense woody areas, any place that you can leave like that a little bit more natural and nurture the decaying matter. And that's why it's so important to avoid tilling where possible, because there's so much life in these ground layers. Lastly, I cannot stress enough how important it is to just continuously question your own assumptions. I mean, I do it all the time, and will still be learning millions of things every day till the end of my life, because the barrage of marketing ploys that we are bombarded with really are something that are just pretty much anti-nature, and to me, anti-successful growing. For me, nothing encapsulates the need to question these things more than the humble molehill. Moles are often considered nuisances, so a lot of people think they eat plants, but that's not the case. They eat invasive earthworms, which most of our earthworms here are invasive. They eat larvae of Japanese beetles, they till the soil, and their mounds draw grasshoppers who then will bring birds to your garden. And then molehills can eventually become little beetle banks. So some farmers build those intentionally out of raised berms or mounds to attract predaceous beetles who feed on other insects and on weed seeds. But if you have moles, you can try simply letting their excavation work create natural beetle banks instead, and build on the work that they're doing. Molehills also can become excellent places for ground nesting bees, and 70% of our 4,000 native bees nest on or in the ground. So that's a lot of pollinators you could be helping by leaving some bare patches like this. And these bees are not something to be afraid of. They're actually solitary, so they don't have a hive to defend. They don't sting. And moss eventually grows over a lot of molehills in the shade, which also draws helpful animals, frogs, as well as birds like this Carolina wren. Here you see him gathering moss from the molehills in our yard to line his nests in the spring. And then those nests in turn were filled with chicks in need of thousands of insects to help sustain them to the fledgling stage. So all of that you can get simply by nurturing a molehill and seeing what happens. So last here, before questions, I want to talk about some ways that you can learn who is living in your garden. Some resources that I found really helpful. Bugguide.net is a place where you can upload photos, and then experts will confirm your identification or steer you in the right direction. Facebook.com/groups/insect.identification is a place where you can do the same thing, perhaps slightly quicker. Kaufman Field Guide to Insects of North America is a great little book filled with pictures and life histories. And I usually start there if I don't recognize somebody, because even if the insect is not in this book, there will be somebody who looks enough like him that I know where I might start to try to narrow it down. And then Caterpillars of Eastern North America, same thing, but for caterpillars. And a few of my favorite books, which is where I learn most of the most fascinating things, is the Xerces Society's Farming with Native Beneficial Insects. So they have a lot of case studies about the effectiveness of hedgerows, beetle banks, pollinator strips, how to do it, and also life histories and species profiles of insects you're likely to see in a vegetable garden or farm. This is a book that is unique, one of a kind, about humane conflict resolution with larger wildlife, mostly mammals. And it's not available anymore in print, but you can get it for free at animalstudiesrepository.org/HUMSPRE/1. And you can also find much of the same information on humanesociety.org/wild neighbors. There's just fewer species there that it covers, but it will give you lots of practical tips on resolving conflicts with wildlife. So Mary, if you wanted to look more about squirrels, you can find some good tips there too. And then The Wildlife Friendly Vegetable Gardener by Tammy Hartung. I profiled her in my book because she's so unique. She grows a bounty for herself and for the animals around her. This book gives a lot of great tips on how to do it. And Discoveries in the Garden by Jim Nardi, I mentioned him earlier. He also wrote a book called Life in the Soil, which some permaculture gardeners might be familiar with. He's a wonderful guy and very knowledgeable, and he has a lot of experiments in this book that you can do with your family to learn who's living in your garden and what they're doing there. And then my book and my website, which fleshes out some of the ideas in my book and in my talks, and my contact information is here. And I just want to mention that I love to hear from people, ideas and suggestions and observations, because there's a lot of science to some of this, and then some of it is experimental. We all learn together, and it's really fun to share observations about these things. So thanks so much, and I will take questions now.
All right, if anybody has any questions, any other questions, that is totally mind-blowing, by the way, Nancy. to look at the garden again. And thank you for reminding us, because like you said, you're just constantly questioning your assumptions, and just to look at the garden or your approach to gardening in a different way that's even more holistic. That I thought that I already was holistic, but just looking at it even more in that big picture perspective of yours. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Do you want me to, let's see, come back to the video?
Yeah, we can do that, and I can share my video too. So, yes, so Mary said, good to know moles, about moles. Thank you, such great information. Thank you, she says. I think we just all need like a moment to pause because there's so many things. Let's see, what did I learn? You were starting to talk about mosquitoes earlier. And if you, hi Gail is just on now. Gail, you had a special mention. You missed your special video, but it's okay. I was able to record, and this is where I was able to record from Ally 3 of Nancy. So if you could kindly show all the 1 to 4 allies that you had originally for people to review. I'm so sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
I had a question. If nobody else will go first, I'll be brave and forge ahead. So in our backyard, we're able to grow a lot of perennials and have a lot of diversity. But I also have a plot in a community garden at my work, and it's even though they're pretty lenient as well as far as community gardens go, because I have the same plot every year. I don't have to till it. There's a lot more of your common insect, insects that cause problems with your annual crops there. And I don't really have the flexibility to grow a lot of these perennials. So do you have any recommendations on like perhaps fast growing annuals that can kind of fill in the same niche as some of these perennials?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because part of it is also that you need to be able to have that decaying matter too, and let some of those things just decay naturally, especially the perennial plants. Are you able to take the annuals and do that and just mass them up, or is it a question of appearances, aesthetics?
Well, I kind of cheat, and we do so many experiments that I put in all these different trees. So maybe I'm not the best case for this, but I'm just thinking a lot of the people who subscribe to our blog, they're can get very easily discouraged when these things, and a lot of them are in urban or suburban situations, so they're kind of limited in terms of what they can grow.
I mean, even in my spot, we had nothing, so I started with very tiny plots, big vegetable gardens, and I did do a lot of annuals actually. And generally, I mean, some of the typical ones that I would see attracting generalist bees, like bumblebees, of course, would be sunflowers and cosmos and zinnias. But I found that was actually a lot more intensive work for me than over time planting a few perennials a year. So even if you have a small space, I know you might not be able to do it at your work, but you can certainly plant some of these lower growing perennials around a food plot. And then that's something that you don't have to keep doing every year. Some of these native plants.
Great. So yeah, I guess some of the resources that you listed, you could probably extract some kind of like master list for community gardens or something.
Yeah, and actually the things like that Xerces Society book, Farming with Native Beneficial Insects, they definitely recommend native hedgerows and native pollinator strips and things like that. But I'm sure they have a few annuals in there too, and they have in their species profiles what some of these insects tend to go for. So that could be helpful too.
Great, I'll check that out.
Nancy, you were beginning to talk about mosquitoes and how they're beneficial. So can you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, well,
Dave gets super bitten. I have like a little bit of immunity from them, I think, because I grew up in the Philippines, but he just.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, Dave is like me because I go outside and I'm eaten alive. So I protect myself I use just like citronella and things like that. But I know if you're going in deeper woods, you have to use more. But anyway, that's the strategy that I recommend rather than actually spraying the broader environment, because you're killing all those other creatures too. You just are. And a lot of companies will claim that it's targeted, but it's not. But mosquitoes, if we did not have mosquitoes, the whole ecosystem would collapse because that many creatures depend upon mosquitoes. So you have your dragonflies, your bats, you have your birds, frogs, all kinds of creatures are eating mosquitoes, and then creatures up the food chain eat them too. And so they're so abundant, as we know, that it would be a huge problem if they were to disappear.
Thanks very much. So Nancy, do you want to show that just to recap that slide of yours that had the four allies? What was it, the first one again?
Oh, you mean
or should I just share? Oh, no. Can I just share, if it's okay, could I share your slides as well when I send out the replay that's not full, the unfull?
Yeah. Let me. Oh, are you there?
Yes.
Yeah. Did you want me to show it now?
What are just the recap? Yes.
Yes. Okay. So the plant allies?
The animal allies.
Okay. Oh, right. The parasitoids and predators.
Yes, because I started the record button at number 3, so some people are going to miss the 1 and 2, but
okay.
Again, just like what is your first one? The first and the second, I can't myself remember it. If you can.
This one, yeah. And which one? Or is this all you needed? Excuse me.
Oh, I can't see it. We don't see it yet.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Share. Okay, sorry. Here we go.
Oh, yes. So the decomposer slugs was what you talked about. And
here we go.
Decomposers, predators, parasitoids, herbivores, and multitaskers. Yes. All right. Well, thank you for that last slide. And I hope to be able to show, for those who are going to watch the replay, then they can just refer to the rest of your slides. Hopefully we can share those as well from you.
Yeah, or we can replay it.
All right. So it is 8:50. Do we have any other questions from the group about how to, as an example, for those who came late, Mary had asked about squirrels, and Nancy so excellently addressed that particular animal. So if you have any questions about animals or allies or how to encourage allies in your organic garden, please type it in before we go. We wanted to say a few things too about this webinar with Nancy. Inspired us to start a challenge of a bug hunt. Again, we've done this in the past, but for our Grow It Yourself subscribers, but we wanted to do this in general for people to show them that it's really beneficial to observe your garden. And Nancy's doing this all the time on her Instagram feed. If you haven't seen it yet, check out Humane Gardener on her Instagram. And she gets really up and close to the bugs. So we're having a bug hunt challenge that's coming up, and we'll share the details with you in an email to follow this webinar. But the prize of the bug hunt challenge for the person who uploads the best, and everybody votes, a best photo of their bug, or, well, we're narrowing it down to bugs, so their best bug photo, and everybody votes who the best bug photo is, enters, will receive a free copy of Nancy's The Humane Gardener book. So I think that's a great reward for that, because it's such a beautifully written book. I love reading it over and over again. It's not with me now because I actually lent it to somebody who's also going to watch this webinar, who's not on here now, but is going to watch this webinar. So thank you once again, Nancy.
Yeah.
Dave, did you have anything else? Any last words?
I had one thing I should have mentioned to Dave in response to you, Dave, which was, one of the reasons that the annual plants aren't as attractive, and I didn't used to see as many insects on them, is that the insects and the plants did not co-evolve together. So that's why there's this emphasis on having native plants that these creatures are used to. For example, there's specialist bees who only go to one certain kind of flower to gather pollen for their young. And so we have 30% of our native bees that do that. And so it's just a matter of kind of having what they're used to eating. And that's why you'll get a lot more diversity that way, if you can plant the native perennials and such.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of inspired to do a little research on kind of faster growing and shorter perennials for community gardens, so that you do have an option for a single year type of thing, just to give you an alternative if you're in a constrained situation like that. Yeah,
that would be good. I mean, then there are kinds of milkweed. I mentioned that a few times. There's short, 1 or 1.5 foot butterfly weed and things like that. Or you could ask the community garden directors wherever you are if they could have a little education and involvement in, if they'd be interested in getting a little bit more information about why it would be helpful overall to all the gardens. There's actually one in Howard County where they have pollinator strips of native plants around it, but it was done by volunteers. It's not actually in the people's plots, but they all support it and they're proud of it. So it's
in permaculture garden design, the pollinator species are like what they call the backbone. So it's one of those. It has to be embedded somehow in the garden. So it's so important.
Yeah.
And I guess to end, I don't see any other questions. If you guys, any webinar replayers, if you have questions, you have Nancy's info right there, nancy@humanegardener.com. And if people get off this call, it's a lot of information, I think, to just think about deeply, because you've thought about it so deeply, Nancy, that maybe something else will pop up throughout the week as this webinar reverberates with us, and then we can send you an email if something does, right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I had a video that I wanted to share about my kids on the day that we did this practice webinar, Nancy. That morning, the kids were outside and they discovered a monarch butterfly. So so it's really precious. So I'll end with that, if you don't mind. Once again, like humanegardener.com, please buy Nancy Lawson's book and support her great work there. And then I'll end with that webinar and then see everybody off. I'll end with that video and see everybody off. I just have to grab the screen from you.
Okay.
Yes.
Do I stop share? Is that what I do?
I think so.
Okay,
yeah.
Sorry. Oh, okay, sorry.
Oh, no, don't be sorry. That's okay. I am going to put it there. Can everybody see my screen? Dave, can you see my screen?
Yep, I can see it.
Just leave it out.
I can see it.
Something else.
Uh-oh, and now I can't, I have to mute certain, if you could kindly mute yourselves so that we can listen to this view. Thank you so much. Here we go. And this is how we'll end and say good night to all of you. Oh,
There's no volume.
oh no. Oh man. I can't play this because for some reason I have to stop share now. This great idea of mine is not a good idea. I'll just send that video some other way. But it was just a precious moment that the kids went all around the monarch. We got so close and they were just and giggles and charm. She was just a charming little monarch. So thank you for this webinar, and we'll see you off. Good night, everyone.